This is policing and the media. Fair to say the police do need the media, and the media, of course, need the police. But the relationship between the two has never been a stable one. Cracks have widened in recent years. What has gone wrong? How do we begin a restart in these kind of areas? There are some police officers and journalists who may understate the importance of their relationship, but it is worth, of course, spelling it out. The police do rely on the media to help them appeal for missing people, wanted people, etc., to encourage witnesses, victims to come forward. Even the aforementioned social media, of course, is incredibly helpful in that respect. Police need them to get those messages across about public safety and reassurance, to provide explanation, often to provide context about complex crimes and offending trends, to deliver information about crimes solved, successful operations, which of course help boost public confidence. For the media, the police are an indispensable source of information and stories. The media, of course, doesn't always play ball, but on a good day it does. They need to talk about crimes reported, crimes solved, allegations, ongoing investigations about public events, demonstrations, terror incidents, etc., natural disasters, acts of bravery and dedication to duty. Fair to say there's barely a newspaper, website or news bulletin that doesn't carry a story every day that has information, comment or material that has been provided by the police. It is a symbiotic relationship, even though neither the police nor the media would perhaps care to admit to it in that respect. It's never been a straightforward relationship, I think we can say that. We're going to have a discussion on all of the various points. Joining us, Danny Shaw, the journalist and commentator on crime, policing and justice. Alan Woods is with us, Head of Media and Public Affairs at the MPCC. Rebecca Camber, Chair of the Crime Reporters Association. Rebecca is also Crime and Security Editor at The Mail. Good to see you. And Asad Mogul, who is Head of Digital Practice at Portland Communications. Welcome to you all. We're going to have a nice discussion on this and hopefully again take some questions. Before we do, it's worth going around the panel and getting a 2 or 3 minute piece from each one on this very issue, policing and the media. Danny, let's start with you. You've got a broadcast and journalistic thoroughbred background, I think we could safely say. And you know this story from many, many different angles. Just give us your overview of that curious relationship between the police and the media.
Well, what I wanted to do was to start with an event that happened 28 years ago at the Old Bailey. And I was covering a pretty grim case, the case of a bunch of schoolboys in South London who were accused of gang rape. And I was covering it for BBC Radio 4 at the time. And I met the senior investigating officer, a guy called Jim Webster, who was a detective chief inspector at the time. And he was very helpful. I didn't know him, but he was very, very helpful in securing me some access to the police, explaining the background to the case. And when the verdicts came in, I had a major piece that ran on Radio 4 at the time, as well as on Newsbeat on Radio 1. And Jim and I kept in touch after that. And he was really my first sort of serious sort of contact with the police. And he provided real insight, background, context on policing for me. I don't know if there's anyone who's listening to this or who's in the room who knew Jim, who very sadly died in 2020. But he was a man of great wisdom, intelligence, thought, complete dedication to policing. And over the years that followed, when he went from the Met to Devon and Cornwall Police, we stayed in touch. He helped facilitate various items that I was doing. And he also learnt a lot about the media, I think, through me as well. And he came, on one occasion, he saw the Today programme go out in the morning. And it's that kind of relationship, and I'm sure Rebecca has some contacts like that in the police as well. It's that kind of relationship that really helps understanding within the media of policing and helps police understand how the media works. And I fear that those sorts of relationships have been on the decline for the past decade or more, for various reasons. We can go into them. The Leveson report, some of the terrible practices that existed in both the media and policing. And it's that kind of relationship that is so important to building understanding and trust between these two that, as you say, have this very vital relationship that exists. We can't shy away from it. We both need each other. The media need the police need the media. And there's no point just retreating into bunkers when something goes wrong, when the media don't get things right or treat the police unfairly, in your view, or vice versa. We have to come together and we have to find some common ground, and we have to accept that we each have a job to do and a role to do. We're not always going to get it right, but we need each other. And so I hope that we're going to have a good discussion today, but we need to rebuild this rather fractured relationship by not retreating into our bunkers, but by meeting in the middle and having and fostering the kind of relationships that I've had with police officers over the years, and which really started with Jim Webster back in 1996.
Danny, thank you. Rebecca, same question. Your overview of that relationship between the police and the media.
Well, I'd like to talk to you on behalf, I'm the chair of the Crime Reporters Association, which you may or may not know. It's a group of specialist journalists who are experts in crime and policing across all national media, including my former vice chair, Danny, here. And I'd like to talk to you about how we can rebuild that relationship that Danny referred to. I've actually compiled a report that's gone to the NPCC and College of Policing. I know Alan will talk about that at some stage. There's 26 recommendations. I've got 3 minutes. We haven't got time. I'm going to give you, effectively, a little bit of the headlines. Last year's Federation Conference, and I know it's just been mentioned here by the chair, they talked about the negativity of the British media. And bluntly, the media seem to be seen as the problem for policing. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how I think that actually the media could be part of the solution. Last year, the Nicola Bulley investigation review revealed exactly what happens when the police don't trust the media enough to tell them the truth about the circumstances of a case. Officers had to issue dispersal orders because a circus of conspiracy theories had brought up really quite crazy behaviour. People were filming themselves searching the river. They were breaking into abandoned buildings. And my worry is, what's to stop that happening again in your investigation? If officers had been forthright with the media from the very start about what they were facing, it would have ended that speculation, public hysteria, and arguably this tragic case would never have led the front pages for 3 weeks. And I don't mean making her health issues public. What I believe should have happened in that case is the officers could have held a non-reportable briefing for the media strictly on background and provide some of that key guidance. Had Lancashire Police told reporters at the start that there were welfare concerns in a clearly defined non-reportable briefing, her disappearance would have been reported very differently, and details of her personal problems might never have come out. This should be happening in every major high-profile investigation. If you want to prevent speculation blazing on social media, be more honest, be more open about what is actually happening. This is the lesson I think policing can learn. If officers are to stand a chance of rebuilding the public's trust and confidence, I know that's already been mentioned this morning, then we need to start by trusting each other again. And that's how we will rebuild that successful working relationship. And actually, it's not just about rebuilding the public's trust and confidence anymore. The riots proved that being upfront with the media has a policing purpose. It's actually about preventing disorder on the streets. Having that honest conversation, dispelling those social media myths, providing guidance about ongoing investigation can make all the difference. We need to ensure the public has accurate information and counter some of these lies, putting the real information out there that the public can actually believe in. We need to start talking to each other again, telling the public about some of the brilliant, heroic, and often thankless work that you all do day in, day out. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you. Asad, you're head of digital practice at Portland. Your thoughts on this curious cat and mouse almost relationship between the police and the media?
Yeah, and I just want to really echo what Danny and Rebecca said. What we're really looking at when we're thinking of the relationship between the media and the police is acting against a background of misinformation, especially on the online space. It's ever increasing. So what do you do? According to the Turing Institute, there's about 94% of Brits have encountered some form of misinformation. And when we look at cases such as the summer riots that happened this year, it has real-world consequences when that misinformation delves out. What's driving this? Everyone has access to information. If we look at our mobile phones, everyone can now just get some form of information, but they don't have access to the full data. They don't have access to everything. But that doesn't stop them from amplifying their content across their own social media feeds. What this means is people are sharing bits of information and creating false narratives online. And once that's been out there, it's really difficult to put that genie back into the bottle. And I think it's really important that we remember that misinformation isn't just being spread by bots. Often when we have these conversations, we talk about the amplification by bots, but actually a lot of people are capable of spreading it themselves. Misinformation has an emotional component. People are more likely to amplify the content that they appeal to their own belief system. And this can be difficult to deal with, especially when the platforms themselves aren't really doing anything to get rid of this misinformation online. So how do we deal with this? And really, I just want to echo what Danny and Rebecca said. The relationship between the police and the media is crucial to this. Misinformation flourishes when there's a vacuum of information, when people don't feel like they're being communicated or given a full story, or even given some form of narrative. They will look at the dots themselves and connect them, and often connect them incorrectly. So the more that you can actually have those relationships with journalists to actually create that narrative, the better it is for you. When you can and when it's relevant, it's important to talk to those message amplifiers within those networks. And in this case, it is those journalists and it is those media contacts. You can control the narrative, allowing less space for the negative narratives to take hold. This going hand in hand with a wider societal piece around education, around misinformation, how to deal with it, and the effects of it and how to recognize it. I mean, misinformation is never going anywhere. I would love to tell you all that there is an easy button to get rid of it, but misinformation is as old as lying, and unfortunately, social media has just given people the opportunity to kind of amplify it further. But if you take one message away from me, it's that you can control the narrative by having those strong relationships with those journalists and with that media.
Asad, thank you. Alan Woods, Head of Media and Public Affairs with the MPCC. Over to you.
So at the National Police Chiefs Council, as Rebecca alluded to, we're working with the College of Policing, heads of communication from the individual forces to progress the recommendations made in the independent review of the Nicola Bulley investigation. And the work that we've done so far has highlighted what I think are the key, or three of the very important challenges that we face at the moment that we must overcome if we're to get this relationship to where it needs to be. And the first of these is the tight financial backdrop against which both policing and the media is working at the moment. To look at that from a media perspective, there is no sustainable business model for the media at the moment, and what that means in reality is fewer trained journalists being employed by the main commercial publishers. And fewer trained journalists brings with it a real risk, and it creates a void. It creates a void that can all too easily be filled by untrained journalists. And we know how easy it is nowadays for untrained journalists to create social media accounts, to create websites, and to purport as journalists when really they are far from that. And don't get me wrong, policing values good journalism. It helps us solve crime, it helps us find people, and we know that the media is a key driver of public trust and confidence in policing. Poor journalism, meanwhile, has a negative impact on society as a whole. And that's why at the National Police Chiefs Council at national level, we've got a really good relationship with the Crime Reporters Association, a productive working relationship with the CRA and the Society of Editors. And we know, for example, that we can call Rebecca for sensitive guidance about high-profile investigations before they hit the media because we have that relationship there. But unfortunately, the same can't be said for journalists, particularly outside of those groups. The same can't be said for all journalists, and the picture is, quite frankly, inconsistent across the country. To look then back inside at policing, I don't think there's anyone in this room or listening who doesn't understand the financial challenges in which policing is working at the moment, and that comes back to communication teams too. There are fewer press officers working in press offices today compared to 4, 5, 6 years ago, and therefore to operate a 24/7 media service to journalists, local, regional, national, it's virtually impossible when you've got some press teams as small as 2 people. The second challenge links to the first one, and that is adapting to the changing media business model. And as I said, the media is challenged. There is no sustainable solution that anyone has found yet to 10 years of newspaper sales declines and the loss of revenue associated with that. And we're in a really interesting era at the moment where those key publishers are exploring how to land their news content with new audiences, new demographics, those who are not engaged with their content. And you'll probably all have seen changes in your local press, your local titles, as they adapt to these challenges that they're facing. And I don't think there would be anyone working in strategy for those commercial publishers who is not completely across the changes in consumer trends that are taking place at the moment. And quite simply, coming back to policing, police communications needs to adapt to that, because if you've got local titles that are no longer reliant on your press releases, on your written form content, police communications must adapt or it risks falling behind and not being able to engage with the public through that key media platform. And the final point, which we've talked about already and no doubt we'll come back to, is the challenges posed by social media. Facebook groups, X, don't close at 5 o'clock when the police press office does. And therefore, we know that misinformation, as we've talked about, spreads faster than almost any media outlet could dream of carrying it. So therefore, against that backdrop of reduced staffing, how do press offices, communications teams set the record straight when misinformation can spread so quickly? And that's why at the National Police Chiefs Council we're progressing those recommendations made in that review. And I think we've got a big opportunity at the moment to open channels of communication between policing and the media. We know that comms is underinvested in policing. Other sectors have got it right, are further down that journey, and we've got a bit of catching up to do.
Okay, Alan, thank you. We'll take some questions from the audience if there are any in just a couple of moments. We've got some coming through from online as well. Just to pick up on a point that Asad and Rebecca both made about that, you know, where there's a void, somebody will try and fill it if the information isn't forthcoming. And I certainly know this from the work I do in broadcast journalism, where the amount of questions, we can't really talk about Southport, but that is an obvious example where people have said a lack of information was one of the issues. But let's talk about your Nicola Bulley and the like. There's more than one void, Rebecca, isn't it? That's the problem. It's all very well, you know, one journalist might say, we need to know this. Another journalist wants to know that. The police are kind of stuck on this, aren't they? How much information is just enough? That might appease your appetite, might not appease my appetite. Where's the line?
I don't know if it's that, so you sort of say as if it'd be different. Actually, I think it's much more straightforward than that. So, though we can't talk about in detail about the riots, and what we do know, I do know from speaking to Merseyside Police, as you alluded to, I do speak to forces entirely off record to provide some advice about ongoing investigations and how they speak to the media, entirely on pay, just because I think it's really important. And I do know that Merseyside feel that there was more they wanted to put out, and they felt quite frustrated about the process. Now, I understand that because everything was, quite frankly, on the streets, things were happening that it was, people were just fundamentally shocked. I think internationally, people couldn't believe in Britain there were riots on the streets because of a truly horrific murder that had happened, that was the result of that. The disinformation that went on, it's very hard to predict that would have happened. But what I can say is that in the wake of the riots, I know personally that having conversations with people and actually just sussing out what really has happened prevented us from writing stories about further misinformation. There were opportunities that were taken by press officers. I'll give you an example. We had a situation where on social media there were videos circulating of a person being killed in a prison. What it looked to be, it was a video of a lot of blood, man on the floor, knife next to them, and it was said, various first-hand accounts being circulated, this is somebody who's just been locked up for the riots, and he's been killed by a Muslim asylum seeker in a cell next to him. Now, when you look at the footage, it sort of looks like that. When you call up a press officer, now they could have said, we can't comment on an ongoing investigation, and then we would be left in a really invidious position of having to run all that commentary with just that line. Instead, a press officer went beyond what ordinarily they'd be allowed to say, and they said this: one, that's not a Muslim asylum seeker, that's not a rioter, that person actually didn't die, they're in hospital, and this happened quite some months ago, and it's got nothing to do with the riots. Now that guidance is, you referred to what's the line, what do we want? That's what we all want, that guidance. That enabled me to go to my news desk and say, this is a load of rubbish. Do not put this in the papers. Had we put this in the papers, what would have been the consequence? Could we have seen further disorder as a result? I think we all need to just really take some sensible, common sense conversations, off record, guidance, what's really happening, and have that trust. And that will enable policing to effectively deal with disorder far more effectively.
I remember some years ago, and this was, I suppose, the infancy of social media, because this was largely a Facebook issue, but those responsible for the death of baby P, you'll remember, were not named. Now, there was a good reason they weren't named, because there were other court cases going on. Now, that wasn't something that ever translated to the public, so somebody, more than one person, set up a Facebook page saying, these are Tracy Connolly and others, as we now know their names, these are the people responsible. Why are the media hiding their names away? You know, we need to name and shame them, as if it was some kind of protection thing. And I remember sitting there almost as a lone voice, messaging administrators of these sites saying, you might want to take this page down, you know, believe me, this is not a good thing. In a case such as that, could the police then have said, the reason we're not naming these people, because that story today would be far worse, you know, those names would be everywhere. Should the police in a case like that say, we can't name the people because there are other considerations, other legal proceedings taking place, or something like that? Is that what they need to do?
Well, I think there are some considerations about that. The Law Commission is looking currently at contempt of court laws,
Yep.
looking at reporting restrictions as well. There is a whole debate to be had about the way that we respond to some of these incidents when there are legal proceedings ongoing. So the way it's currently been is essentially someone's charged, and you can't say anything pretty much after that point. But that vacuum that exists now on social media is sort of just spiralling in the background. And I think that it would be helpful sometimes if the police, actually the CPS I've spoken to, came out and they said, would it be helpful if after the riots we put out some definitions of what contempt of court really is? So, I think that would be really helpful. So the public understand. That's the key thing, having that conversation and really communicating to the public why there might be something else going on here, rather than feeding into exactly what you're referring to there, joining the wrong dots. Yeah,
and there's a lot of that. Here's a question that came from Paul, who says, I'd be interested to know why some national media would appear to be so anti-police in their coverage. I mean, Danny, do you sense that? I mean, certainly I see anti-police sentiment on social media, and I think it was it Alan or Assad who referred to quite inexperienced journalists, or this new thing called citizen journalists, which is in fact, the translation of that is not a journalist usually, but it's just a great way of calling yourself something. You know, but it's a fair question, isn't it? Is there a sense, is it a perception, is it a reality?
I think it's a perception rather than a reality. I worked at the BBC for 31 years, and since then I've worked as a freelance journalist for a number of organisations and outlets. I don't think there is an anti-police agenda. I think the reality is that we are not in the media, we're not cheerleaders for the police, we're not here to do your PR work, that's not what we're about, and we're not here to report when you just do straightforward stuff that we expect you to do. If you're a police officer and you have a number of interactions during that day and they all go perfectly well according to plan, that's not a news story.
Yeah.
The one interaction you have that ends in a complaint or in misuse of force or something going wrong, that is a news story. And I think there's a misunderstanding about what we're about and what the police are about. It's exactly the same in a hospital. We don't report, do we, on nurses that don't kill babies. Yeah. We do report on nurses who do. And so I think you need to understand that and also see it in the context of recent years when a number of really serious scandals involving the police have come to light. I don't need to name them all and list them all. We have to cover that, we have to report that, and we have to try and understand if that is saying something about policing as an institution. I honestly think the people that I've met and I've worked with in the media don't have an anti-police agenda. They actually want the police to succeed, and we actually love it when there's a great investigation, you've caught the bad guy, they've been brought to court, and they've been locked up.
Yeah.
And that's your moment, that's policing's moment, to actually say, look what we've done this great investigation and we've got justice for the victims.
But then with the riots, Danny, there was a lot of people that didn't think the rioters were the bad guys. They were almost sort of martyrs to the cause in some kind of respect. Free speech warriors, you know, protecting a changing society, the lack of information from the police. That's how some people perceive that. I mean, that's not for you or Rebecca to have to deal with that, I appreciate, but that is certainly an issue that's out there.
Well, there was a perception. I think initially in the early days, I think I think there was genuinely, most people just wanted the police to get a hold of the situation and for the rioters to be, to be apprehended and brought to justice. And then when some of the court cases have played out, some people have talked about two-tier justice, and it appears that some people that just sending tweets on social media were dealt with very harshly when others weren't. I personally don't think that's the reality of the situation, but we're into, people have strong views, these views get political, but just coming back to your question, I don't think there is an anti-police agenda. I think there are one or two journalists that might have particular bugbears or particular points they wish to make, and they do pursue those. But broadly speaking, we are there to report what police do without fear or favour, and we try and do that. But we're not there to do your PR, and you need to remember that.
It's interesting that in the riots 2011, same thing was happening, big court cases. I remember one fellow got jailed for 2 years for stealing water. We remember those kind of cases. Nobody called it two-tier policing then, of course.
No, that's right.
Rebecca, you wanted to chip in on that?
I do. So I actually want to come in specifically on that question. I've got some stats for you here.
We love a stat, Rebecca.
I think it's useful. The Superintendents Association commissioned a survey, and they looked at media coverage of policing in a month. It was some time back, but they essentially categorised whether stories were negative or positive, and the positive ones were because they praised bravery, heroism, community spirit, or charity work. And then there was ones that they considered were neutral, because they were just about charges or being arrests. And so the stats were 32% of those stories were negative, 11.6% were positive, and 55.9% was neutral, neither good nor bad. But when you add that up together, so put the neutral bit together and the positive bit, that's actually 67.5% of all policing stories being either positive or neutral. That doesn't sound nearly so bad, because that's the bit that really matters to the public, taking the bad guys off the streets, the charges, the arrests, finding missing people and helping those at their most vulnerable. It's that daily work that gives the public comfort and with it confidence.
Here's a question from James. He says, has the police service taken the Leveson report too far and now view the media as an enemy rather than a useful relationship? Assad, what do you say to that?
Oh, I think that's an interesting one. I'm not sure if that's the case. I think I would go more with your points around the fact that actually there aren't enough people actually to deal with the media on both sides of the relationship, so whether it's the media or whether it's the police. So often the police forces aren't putting enough resource into it. I don't think it's a case that they're viewing it in a negative fashion, personally. And I think the issue really more is kind of the perception amongst the audiences rather than actually that relationship with the media and the police themselves. So, for example, it's more dealing with the fact of how do you deal with public that's expecting news 24/7. We've got used to the fact that actually information will be available to us 24/7, but when journalists and press officers can't work those times, how do you deal with that vacuum? And I don't think anyone's got the solution to that as of yet.
Alan?
Do you know what I think? I think there is a lack of understanding of each other's worlds here, and I think that is where a lot of this stems from. So, to touch on the Leveson point, I think newsrooms and police press offices are very different places today to how they were 12 years ago post-Leveson. But I think there's also, I think it goes both ways as well. I think there are journalists who don't understand the pressure on press officers because the role of the press officer has evolved significantly in recent years. They're no longer there just to answer media inquiries. They're omnicompetent. They work across communication disciplines, working with colleagues in campaigns to harness the value of the media in behaviour change campaigns, for example. But then to look at it from the other side, I think you have got people working in police communications in press offices who don't necessarily understand the target-driven environment in which some journalists are working. Because I think a key differentiation here, which comes back to all the work we're doing with individual forces, is the national versus the local media. Because we've got a great relationship with the Crime Reporters Association, for example, but you've got regional, local newsrooms that are target-driven. There's lots of coverage about this in the trade press and how there are story quotas for some journalists. And therefore, some of the inquiries that these local journalists send into police press offices, for example, I get why they can be frustrating. It's the kind of like 2 police cars parked outside a supermarket. Why were they there last night? And you feel that response sometimes within communications. It's kind of like this eye roll vibe. Yeah. Why are you asking about something like this? But at the same time, if there's a photograph of these 2 cars outside the supermarket on social media with 100 comments on it, coming back right to the start, it's the police's place to set the record straight and to set outline what's happened there. So yeah, I think there's a lack of understanding.
Okay, any questions in the room? Anyone want to throw a question in? Just stick your hand up. Right down the front here, we can get a microphone. As quick as you like. There it is. Look at that speed, lightning speed.
Thank you. This is a question for mainly Rebecca, actually. You've touched upon whether or not police stories are newsworthy or not. And I've got a question about the Nicola Bulley investigation. Looking at that now, post-investigation, it seems like, in actual fact, it was a fairly routine policing incident that probably happens up and down the country, as tragic as it is quite often. What do you think the tipping point was that meant that that incident got so much media attention compared to other incidents that were ongoing at the time that were probably more newsworthy in the cold light of day?
So I entirely agree with you. And actually, I think, just going back to what I originally said here, that if they just had a chance or put out the circumstances of what the officers were facing, I suspect, actually, in the words of Danny's former colleague who was covering it for the BBC, he said I probably would have gone home that day. It probably wouldn't really been a big story for us. It definitely is something that happens up and down the country. People sadly go missing, and sadly there are accidents all the time. What made that a really big story was that she went missing on the school run, effectively, in broad daylight. She went missing in circumstances that the public couldn't see. Apart from the conspiracy theory, how could that have happened? You know, where could she possibly have gone? Who could possibly have got involved? And I think the problem was that when the questions were going into the police saying, has she been murdered? Could there have been somebody else? They weren't saying that that's actually not what we're looking at here. That really, we think it's probably an accident here, and there are other circumstances going on at home, and you know, there's a bit of a background here. Instead, they were just stonewalling all of that. And that was the problem, that suddenly the fact that somebody's been murdered on the school run in broad daylight is a massive national story. A woman on their own, the context we've been talking about, violence against women and girls, that's a major national newspaper story and a national media story. And the reality was it wasn't that. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. And there are circumstances in which stories become more prominent because of what's going on in the media at the time, or it might be that if you look at, say, disappearance of children on holiday, you know, we all know about that case, don't we, in Portugal, that received massive coverage at the time. There are certain things that become really conscious in the public mind. And I do know, so as a woman of sort of 44, I'll tell the next generation, my friends were saying to me, I can't believe it, that could have happened to me. We were on the school run with our children, could that happen to us? And it was that national sense of fear, I think, that really became a massive story.
But there was criticism of the police when they did release personal details.
Well, that's what. So I don't think they should have released the personal details. I'm not asking that. What I've said is that they should have just told the media in a non-reportable sense, and then we'd understand it and we could frame our reporting.
Just before I come to Danny,
way.
somebody's asked a question on that point. How would that, the in-camera briefing that you referred to, that wouldn't stop the blaze? This came from Rob. The blazing speculation on social media, of course, that would still continue.
I disagree, actually. So, yes, we cannot control what goes on social media, there's no question. But when the media have all these questions, we then run unanswered questions, ... And that plays into all of that speculation, all of those questions. And if the media would have been dealing with it in a tiny different... We wouldn't be on front page. It wouldn't be running on TikTok because it wouldn't have got that pickup.
Yeah. But Danny, you wanted to come in.
So a couple of points on the Nicola Bulley case. One of the recommendations from the report was to hold more non-reportable briefings with the media at an early stage to try and give them some background information that can't be said publicly, but to sort of guide the media perhaps away from the story. This isn't a big murder investigation we're looking at here. There may be some background personal issues. And I think one of the recommendations was that should have happened. I've been told that has now happened in several other missing person inquiries, quite similar to that, in various parts of the country. I was told that yesterday. And that the result of that has been minimal media coverage. It hasn't exploded in the way that case did. That case became a kind of Miss Marple case. This woman's just vanished into thin air. What's happened? She's been abducted, she's been murdered, which wasn't the case at all. Just the other thing about controlling social media, it's a very good question. Look, one thing we're all going to have to accept, you cannot control every aspect of the media and coverage. It's impossible. So don't start with that kind of idea that you can do it because you can't. But what you can do is you can influence some of the key outlets, some of the mainstream media outlets, such as the Mail, such as the BBC, Sky and others, through good briefing, through good relationships, and that has a ripple effect. It's not going to affect all the kind of mad people who are out there, unfortunately, and some of the rubbish that proliferates on social media, but you can have a strong influence without having overall control.
Sad, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, and I think we can't underestimate the symbiotic relationship between media and social media. Often a lot of these voices that are on TikTok and get amplified further on will rely on the media as kind of giving them some validation of what they're doing. So if they look like there's a vacuum of information on the media, they will then take that on to TikTok and they will say, look, there's a lack of information here. Why is this happening? And on places like Facebook as well, when we look at groups, they're often more on a local level, and they are amplifying the content that they're seeing on the media. So yes, completely, you cannot control everything that's going across on social media, but you can mitigate some of those effects.
Here's a question from Rupinder who says, how can the MPCC best guide local forces about building a good relationship with the media? Alan?
So that's the work that's ongoing at the moment. We're looking at how we can provide that guidance to Force Communications team about what good looks like. So you consider the role of the MPCC. We aren't there to mandate to forces in any way how they should exactly operate. That operational independence, particularly with officers, remains key, but we can provide that guidance. And I'll touch on the report that Rebecca alluded to earlier, which was from the Society of Editors, Crime Reporters Association, Media Lawyers Association. That was 26 recommendations of what I would best describe as quick fixes to help rebuild that relationship. And we took that report away, we consulted with heads of communication for the individual forces, and we were able to support 60% of those recommendations almost straight away, with the remaining 40% being considered how we can make that work. So from MPCC perspective, it's around identifying what works, sharing that with forces, and where there is engagement between us and Rebecca around what the media think would make that relationship better, we'll work with that and provide it to them. Because it's a two-way thing at the end of the day. We need that input from the media to shape how force communication teams work in the face of those challenges I described at the start.
Yeah. And in terms of, just to go back to that point of there being more openness, Rebecca, and the media can play their part in this, in terms of reporting things or not inflaming things or not speculating if is just a little bit more information forthcoming. The problem with that, even within the mainstream media, as you guys know, there's always going to be that odd journalist that thinks, I want greater clicks, I want more than the next guy. So Rebecca might be playing ball over there at the Mail, but here at the Mirror, the old sails are flagging a little bit, so let's run a big splash on X, Y, and Z. Would the media join in the spirit of that, in the same way that political journalists, the off-the-record kind of comments and the lobby briefings, etc. Would crime journalists join in with that, or would they?
I don't know who you're hanging out with, the Mirror, etc. I mean,
yeah, I picked the Mirror for no particular reason.
The Crime Reporters
The
Association.
Daily Star. Let's go for the Daily Star.
It's
all right?
been in existence since 1945.
Yep.
And we have had briefings, trusted briefings with police officers since that time. We have a circumstance, we have histories where there was a time when Millie Dowler's killer was not actually the man originally in the frame. And Surrey Police had us in and spoke about that individual investigation and what they were doing. And they said, you can't report who this person is while we're investigating. Nobody from that briefing has ever said a single word about what was said in that room. And that was decades ago. The reality is that the CRA have never, ever breached a single one of these investigations, and nor would we ever, because you'd be out.
No, and I don't think for 1 minute they would, but there are other journalists that might, and with a hungry editor. I mean, not everyone, we were talking about lack of experience in journalism. That's not just on social media, it's not just citizen journalists. You don't have to look very far on, official websites of some publications to see the, forget the grammatical errors and crimes in that respect, but everybody is hungry for a click. So there are other journalists outside of your area, which is, I know, well respected, that might not play that game.
Well, there are established mechanisms for doing this. So if you don't trust the people in the room, I would say initially, make sure you have the people that you trust in the room. If you don't, then get them to sign a non-reportable pre-verdict briefing. And that is a document in which you get the reporter and the editor sign, and it's a legal agreement. Effectively, it's not held by a court, sort of contempt of court, but it is it's a civil agreement, isn't it? Saying, I will not disclose this until such time as the force agree to do so, and do that. That is a standard way. And I don't know, Alan, I bet you've seen that people don't. Nobody's breached that. You can't breach that because you can't then go to a press conference in any way and start doing that and still
I
have
agree. A good journalist would never want to brief.
No.
You know.
And if you have a journalist who does breach it, that's their chance blown, essentially. They're not coming back for the next one. So
exactly.
any trained professional journalist who values that relationship, as they should do with police force, would not go and do that.
I think we have to also acknowledge here, I mean, you know, as journalists, that there have been some cases and occasions when journalists have done some pretty terrible things. I think after the Manchester Arena bombing, I think the treatment of some of the victims, some of the people who learned about what had happened through journalists and so on, door knocking, intrusion, I've become much more aware over my career about the impact of reporting crimes and cases on victims. And perhaps I think some of the younger journalists that come in are not always aware of that because, as you say, there's a pressure to get a story. So, you know, we have to learn some lessons in the media as well, as trying to, you know, educate the police a bit about the relationship and what we need to do to improve the relationship. We have to acknowledge that we have made mistakes, and we've got a constant effort to try and get media and journalists to understand their responsibilities. But I think trust is the key, and I would appeal to anyone who's watching this, you know, in your local area, build relationships with journalists you trust. And if they don't breach that trust, and if you can really carry on that good relationship, then that, I think, will be of benefit to yourself and the police force.
Okay. Any other questions in the room before we move to a final one on social? Let's go to... Oh, there's a question right in the middle there, sir. Yeah.
Morning. We've heard about trust. We've heard in relation to NX 121, and we've heard about 7 media outlets requesting the lifting of that anonymity. What are your thoughts in relation to that? And you talk about trust with the police and how can we trust media outlets if they're requesting that sort of information? And now we see the ramifications of that. Any one of you?
If I can take that. So, look, so I was one of those media organisations. I was one of the people who applied that. I know that's probably not going to be very popular in this room, but effectively open justice, even as a solicitor for Martin Blake said, is a key principle of our democracy. There has never been a situation where someone has gone on trial for murder anonymously, ever in this country. And we felt that there shouldn't be a precedent like that. Now, I recognise now, I had sat through every single day of Martin's trial. I sat through all the pre-hearings. I recently had a meeting with a recorder of London about press as well, and I talked to him afterwards about it. I know his mailbox has been pretty hefty since. There is a really key principle here, which is a fundamental element of our democracy. And I have to also say that I have written to the Home Secretary recently to talk to her about the fact that there's now a statutory provision for anonymity. I think there's actually something that should be in the hands of the judges, as it always has been. It shouldn't be for the politicians to decide who is named at trial or not. There may be a circumstance. In this particular trial, obviously Martin was judged by a jury to be entirely innocent of any crime whatsoever. But the media, in going into that, in making that application, we didn't know what the verdict would be. We didn't know about the circumstances of the case. None of the evidence had been heard. And what we knew was that there should be a common principle for any person facing a serious crime as murder, that they're not anonymous, that they face the same sanction as anybody else in that courtroom of the Old Bailey. And also, I would raise one other thing. We talked before about openness, about transparency, and actually, the police, as we all know, have had really fundamental issues with this, and very, very big cases. Firearms officers, in fact, as we know, Wayne Couzens, David Carrick. If we flip the coin and look at a certain different circumstance, not Martin Blake's case at all, but let's examine a case where a firearms officer shot a child by mistake. Can you imagine the public sentiment if that person was not named? Can you imagine potential disorder as a consequence?
They would be named if they were found guilty, and the argument was always that a serving firearms officer is an exception to the rule. as maybe an MI6, MI5 spy might be in the same kind of way.
Well, I understand that. There's never been a MI5 or MI6 gone on trial for murder.
Not that we know of.
Well, I think we do know that's the case.
No, my point is that the anonymity can play a part, and there can be an intelligent reason why.
Well, that's why a judge, with all the evidence, should
Yeah.
be the people to weigh it up in the individual circumstances of a case.
But we now know the upshot of naming that officer.
We do, and actually the
So
judge...
he's in hiding, his family's in hiding, his kids are in hiding.
The judge knew that at the time. So, as I said, I've seen all the documents. He saw the documents. Those threats were made prior to that person being named.
So surely the safe decision would have been to not name the officer.
That is a question for the Recorder of London, not for myself.
All right. Danny, final point on that?
I think the measure that's come in, I think it probably will be left to a judge to decide, but I do think it is the rule will be drawn up so it will tip it more towards a presumption of innocence. I just hope that whatever guideline is drawn up, that it's very, very tightly drawn up and applies only in very specific circumstances like this, because otherwise it could open the door to people with great resources, to brilliant lawyers, wealthy people who want to hide what they've done, to argue, well, my life's at risk. I've been accused of murder. I've been accused of serious crime. There are death threats against me, so why should my name be made public? That's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned it's that sort of slippery slope argument. Once you open the door a bit to anonymity, then you jeopardize open justice and other people will take advantage of it.
Okay. Listen, guys, thank you very much indeed. Big thank you to Alan Woods, Danny Shaw, Rebecca Camber, and of course, Asad Mogul. Thank you. Great to have you with us. It does bring us to a little bit of a break. We're going to be off air in a couple of moments, a short break. If you've got any questions, of course, for question time, as I mentioned, fill in your card, put it in the little box as you go out for a cup of tea. Tea and coffee are in the bar area. Do return to your seats because this is recorded, because it's going out live. Really important you're back at about 11:25. If you can be back for then, that would be fabulous.